Hello and welcome to the ALM Freeboard and Peters webcast, The Psychology of Fraudsters. I'm Brad Blickstein, your host for today's event. It seems that we can't pick up the newspaper today without seeing stories about fraud, from Bernie Madoff to the state of Illinois to the latest cyber breach. As this is the world we live in, it's crucial to understand what goes on in the mind of these perpetrators, how they act, and why. And what we'll learn is that their behaviors and forces behind them are shockingly consistent. Today we have the fraud guy, Neal Levin of Freeborn and Peters, to introduce us to this nefarious world, describe what drives these fraudsters, and explain how anyone with a need to prevent losses and recover assets can outplay the cheats and tricksters. Neal will be taking your questions at the end, so feel free to post them anytime. Neal?
Thank you very much, Brad, and welcome everyone. First, I'll make my initial promise before we begin. I promise you that we're going to have a discussion today that'll be roughly 10% or less law. While lots of talk is in the mainstream media about all of the very popular Ponzi and related schemes these days, the focus is primarily on the technical components. And what we're going to do today is we're going to have some fun with this. We're going to go inside the mind of a fraudster and basically get a better understanding of how it is that these fraudsters were able to perpetrate the various types of schemes. Because it's through that mind of the fraudster that I think all of us can become better practitioners or professionals relative to the work that we do, where we may be coming into contact with these folks, sometimes known and sometimes unknown. So with that, let's get started. Some very important facts I think everyone needs to know. So follow along briefly here. And if you would, during this process, although technology is great in these webinars, we don't have audio for you. So at this point, I'd like everyone to start singing in their head the theme to 2001 Space Odyssey. My graphic arts team loves that one. And I think as funny as it might be, it's a very poignant question that we have to ask ourselves. Basically, what have we become? I'll draw a lot of parallels to our Neanderthal and human ancestors, but let's dive in first to try and answer the question, well, what really is fraud in this context? Well, we can go through the basic definitions of fraud. You've all got a dictionary handy, I'm sure, and it'll look something like this: international perversion of truth for the purpose of inducing another, blah, blah, blah. Or we can maybe look at a different definition that looks something like this: a false representation of a matter of fact, whether by words or conduct, by false or misleading allegations, blah, blah, blah. But I really believe that the best way to understand the question, what is fraud, or to answer the question, what is fraud, is to start looking immediately at the various types of fraud. I'm sure many of you may have had some experience in this area, so these will sound familiar to you, but let's run through the list. Ponzi schemes, of course, taking a lot of the headlines these days. Occupational fraud, that's fraud that occurs within the organization, billions and billions of dollars every year being lost within major corporations around the world due to insiders who are conducting nefarious activities within. Insurance fraud, of course. Insurance fraud schemes go back actually to the early 1800s, the first insurance fraud scheme that was reported at least. So these have been around for quite a while. Tax fraud, of course, there's different types of that. There's tax evasion, there's tax avoidance, which is all the rage right now, especially relative to what's going on in offshore financial centers, and I will touch on that later. There's government corruption, of course. Hey, and we're from Chicago here, so we know all about government corruption. Bank fraud, plenty of that, and it seems to have surfaced even more in recent years in a variety of fashions. Mortgage fraud, boy, that's certainly been in the headlines. Asset misappropriation, concealment, the so-called asset protection plans. I love that. We actually have one of my partners here is an estate planner, and we have very lively debates on whether or not you actually can create an estate plan and an asset protection plan when you actually owe somebody money. So if you've signed a loan, could there be such thing as an asset protection plan? A great debate we can have some other time. And corporate governance. Of course, lots of problems there as well. Again, being from Chicago, we got a lot of experience there. One of my favorites, bankruptcy fraud. If you go to the, might still be up there, I haven't checked actually in the last couple of months, to the website of the Executive Office of the U.S. Trustee, they have been claiming for a long time that one of their number one targets is shutting down bankruptcy fraud because it's rampant. So we've been working a lot with in the bankruptcy community on that. And, of course, a couple of my newer favorites, FCPA. Those of you familiar with it know that this has been around. This is the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, of course. Been around since the 70s, but it's been flatlined until about 2008, 2009 when the bubble burst here. And we've had record prosecutions or investigations under the FCPA in 2010. They've now tapered off a bit as the government tries to deal with all those, but even those are taking having a new look to them now as we come out of the fallout. We could touch on that a little bit later as well. And you've got offshore financial centers. This is my new favorite. It's a hot one. You've got the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act. You've got the UK and the US looking very heavily at what's going on in these offshore financial centers. Trillions of dollars being held offshore. And the number one reason that people use the offshore financial centers remains today asset protection. But there are a lot of other reasons. A lot of corporations are using offshore financial centers as shells for operations, and we're seeing tax avoidance schemes where they may not be evading tax, but they're avoiding it through loopholes in the law that put unoccupied offices in places like Liechtenstein, but they get the benefit of not having to pay the tax on the income that they run through that. So very hot topic right now. You'll see a lot more on offshore financial centers in the next year or two. So not only do we want to look at the types of fraud, we'll look at, well, when is fraud created as a way of answering what is fraud. The best time for fraud is when incentive meets opportunity with rationalization. Think about that for a second. So my favorite story in this regard, my mother's company had a woman working for her, and she was driving to a nightclub one day and one evening, and she pulled up, and there was the valet stand sitting out front of the club, and there was a person standing next to the valet stand, and she handed her keys to that person and went in the club. When she came back, of course, no one knew what the ticket was that she had. They didn't recognize it, and her car was gone. So here is an opportunity meeting incentive. The valet guy or the faux valet guy had the incentive. He needed a car. The opportunity arose. Someone handed him the keys, and he rationalizes it in that he didn't steal. He actually just was handed the keys and drove the car. So we say in fraud, and think about this in a banking context, securities context, just the operation of any business. If you provide the opportunity for someone, they may come up with the incentive. That might be the need for money, and then they'll rationalize it and say, well, it was there and I took it. So these three factors have to come together, and when they do, you have fraud. There's another factor we're going to touch on. We call it greed, but I'm going to get to that later because we'll discuss more of the psychology of the victim towards the end of the presentation. So in addition to understanding when fraud can occur, in addition to understanding the various types of frauds that we have, understanding the various types of schemes is also helpful in answering what is fraud. We have CD scams, created, packaged, marketed, and sold real estate-backed investments. We have arbitrage in foreign stamps, thanks to our friend Charles Ponzi himself. Overstock, electronic trade, gold mines, oil, and one that even Brad and I were talking about just before the presentation started. Hopefully some of you caught this on NewYorkTimes.com. We have Dennis Hope is selling, and has been for many years, lots of land on the moon. You can buy yourself a plot for about $19.95 to $24.95, and how you're going to go and visit it, we're not quite sure yet, but he's actually been doing this for quite some time and makes no qualms about it, thinks that what he's doing is perfectly legitimate, hence the rationalization. The problem I have with all that is not so much what he's doing, but the fact that people are still buying those lots. And again, we'll get to the mindset of the victim a little bit later. So fraud will come to you in many different ways. Of course, it will come to you post-discovery of the scheme, as it comes to most people. So in other words, after it's too late, the money's been stolen, the deed has been done, and you're coming upon the case or the individual well after the fact. That's the majority of the cases. Maybe it's even post-indictment or post-sentencing, as in many of the cases, or some practitioners out there that are asked to help do the cleanup work. But very rarely does it come to us prior to the transaction, and very rarely does it come to us prior to the discovery of the scheme itself. Look at just about any of the mainstream schemers out there, Madoff, Rothstein, Sanford, any of these guys, and most notably, the fraud was not discovered until well after the fact, and oftentimes it wasn't discovered. It was basically handed to the investigator or handed to someone else, or an inside whistleblower pulled the plug on an operation, as the case was with Petters. His lieutenant of many years decided she had enough, wore a wire, walked back into the office, and the rest is history relative to the Petters Ponzi scheme. So these things all come in different forms, shapes, sizes, but they really do have something all in common, and that is the psychology or the genetic makeup of the fraudster. So what is the issue that we're confronting with? Well, like Warren Miller says, every now and then the tide goes out and you see who's been swimming naked. These people have been around for a long time. When I say these people, I'm fondly referring to them as the fraudsters. They've been around for a very long time. And this fraud has been going on for a very long time. And the Madoff scheme and the Petters scheme and so many of these other nefarious activities have been going on for a long time. Or if you're a lender and you have a fraudster as a borrower, when you finally discover that they were a fraudster, which you didn't perhaps recognize during underwriting, you realize this has been going on for a long time. It's very rare that we come upon these things when they're fresh. Wouldn't make for a very good fraud scheme. So we're seeing that when the economy allows us to, that tide goes out, and we see a lot of people whose cash flows into the scheme dry up. And so right now, more than ever, we're dealing with fraud at levels that have been basically unparalleled. So let's go right into the genetic makeup of the professional fraudster. The genetic makeup is such that the professional fraudster has a primordial instinct to conquer. This is all about superiority. Think about that one for a second. A fraudster wants to show that they are superior. And borrowing from our Neanderthal and human ancestors, that was effectively the male role. Go out and show superiority to the enemy. Bigger, stronger, scream louder, thump your chest harder, slam the bones or clubs harder. And that was a sign of showing that you're better and that you should back off. This is a common characteristic of all fraudsters. There's no rules and no laws for the fraudster. They work in a soulless, lawless, ruleless existence. They're showing superiority, and it is not about the money. I've been challenged on this one time and time again. I'm going to say it probably 10 times through the presentation. It's not about the money to a fraudster. We say that money is the byproduct of the fraudster's need to show superiority. If money comes with it, fine. But most important to the fraudster is that they, in an ongoing basis, need to feel that they are superior to you. Why would someone in a high position in a bank, also out of Chicago, by the way, we get the best of them here, this is an executive at a bank, lots of money, lots of stocks. Why would he need an extra $19 million? And this case broke a couple of years ago. He didn't need an extra $19 million, but by taking the extra $19 million, he was able to show that he was superior to the people who otherwise thought that they were protecting that $19 million, and they did a bad job of it. Of course, eventually he got caught, so he wasn't so superior. But that brings up an interesting dynamic as well. Think about it. If you have any experience whatsoever with a fraud, think about the fraudster and think to yourself, what was most important to this person? Probably every act that they took, even after being busted for the fraud, as many of them sit in their jail cells today and still believe that they're smarter than everyone else and that they didn't actually get caught, or this is just they got sidetracked for a while and some come right back out and they commit the fraud again, those that are allowed back out. Some will stay there for life. But even in prison, they will write, and their briefs will show, or their letters will show, or their interviews will show that they still think that they're smarter than everyone else. That's the key takeaway. And so as a practitioner, as a lender, as a fund manager, as anybody who's trying to protect themselves from being a victim of fraud, you need to think to yourself, who is it that this person is trying to show that they're smarter than? Usually it's the world for a fraudster. So, again, it's not about the money. We'll go back to that a couple more times, and I'll give you some examples. So what is it then? Again, superiority, the need to conquer. A lot of people have written about this. Psychologists and sociologists back to the 17, 1800s have started studying this particular area, but we're seeing more and more now coming into the mainstream, especially when fraud has become so mainstream. So insanity without delirium is one of my favorite quotes here. Behavior that is marked by a complete remorselessness. If you need a picture other than the fine picture that I provided for you here to sort of illustrate what this means, think to yourself any of the close-in headshots, photos, interviews of any of the famous fraudsters, Madoff or the others, and just look at their eyes and tell me whether or not you've ever seen any remorsefulness whatsoever. Well, we can extend that beyond just the fraudster, too. What about the fraudster's, significant others? How about the 60-minute interview of Mrs. Madoff, where they do those nice, close, tight-in shots where all you can see is the face, and you're looking at her talk about her book that she's going to write on the fraud, and you're left to answer the question, did she know? Well, we can all have our opinion on whether she knew, but most importantly is whether or not there was any remorse in not knowing. And so sometimes even the family members aren't able to have that remorsefulness, but clearly within the fraudster's mind itself, there is never any sign of remorse. Because again, in a soulless, lawless society, they don't look at what they've done as being wrong. They look at it as being right, especially because they were showing their superiority. Other people have written on this as well. The definition of a psychopath is compelling. An intelligent person characterized by poverty of emotions. I love that one. Poverty of emotions. Who has no sense of shame, is superficially charming, is manipulative, who shows irresponsible behavior, and is inadequately motivated. If you've experienced fraud, put your fraudster into this model and see if it fits. If it's a professional fraudster and not a wannabe, a two-bit thief perhaps, then they're going to fit this definition. Because every one of the fraudsters I've dealt with in 23 years fits this definition. Poverty of emotions, no shame in what they've done. They're very charming. They're extremely manipulative. They show irresponsible behavior, and they're inadequately motivated. So all they want to do is show that they're superior. They have a shrewdness and agility of mind. I'll have to tell you, one of my trophy moments in practicing in this area was during one of the largest involuntary bankruptcies in the Northern District of Illinois. And it was an involuntary bankruptcy that we filed on behalf of our client, our creditor client. And in that involuntary bankruptcy, in the middle of it, while things were heating up and we were breaking down the fraudsters' various veils and shields and breaking down asset protection, et cetera, I called up the target's counsel. And I said, Scott, invite your client to dinner. The three of us. We'll go out. We'll have a good time. He says, what, are you crazy? I said, no, seriously. Just invite him to dinner and see what he says. 5 minutes later, I get a phone call. Absolutely. And Scott's dismayed. He doesn't believe it. He says, I can't believe it. He immediately said yes. And a few days later, we went out for 3.5 hours of one of the most fun evenings I've ever had. Great time. Excellent conversation. Lots of laughs, sharing wine and fine food and so on. It was delightful. This guy was as charming as they come. But everything he did was about showing that he was superior. He had to be smarter than everyone. He had, the list goes on with this guy. He had basically 2 lives, a life in Chicago and then a life with a mistress out in Hawaii. He had several homes. He had business activity all over the country. He was a real estate developer. Just 20 years he had been doing this and leaving a trail behind him of banks and partners and lenders and lots of litigation, but no one was able to actually penetrate this guy. And I tell you, the day after I had that fabulous dinner with him, we'd file probably the most dramatic motion that we'd file in the case based on emails that we had recovered where he was basically saying to his mistress in Hawaii, I'm very sorry that Neal Levin is bothering you. We're going to get you out of this. The problem is that all my assets are in the name of others, and we have to try and undo all of this. Well, if that wasn't the first page of every document I would file after that, through the end of the case, then of course we beat him. We showed that we were smarter than him. And at that point, there was an interesting mutual respect. Not my respect for him as a being necessarily, but my respect that he was able to do this for 20 years and no one could take him down. And the respect he got is that there was actually someone who was as smart as him who could break it down. A very interesting dynamic. In the end, we succeeded. Lots of money was recovered. But it wasn't until we really figured out what he was about, understand his story, find out what it is that he coveted most, what was he trying to show he was smarter than everyone about, that we finally penetrated him. And at that point, the rest was history, as we say. So shrewdness and agility of mind. They talk entertainingly. They're exceptionally charming, as we say. More specifically, they have no criminal intent. It's amazing that we get as many prosecutions as we do. I mean, clearly, based on the criminal code and the interpretation of intent, we have been able to prosecute these fraudsters. But really, when it comes right down to it, their intent wasn't criminal. Yes, their intent was to conduct their business in the way that they did or undertake a transaction the way that they did, which left someone else a victim. No question. And they're trying to create victims only by virtue of the fact that they want to show that they're smarter than these people. They look down at these people. My victims are just people that I use as a tool to continue doing what I'm doing to keep myself up on this pedestal. So yeah, we've satisfied the legal obligation of criminal intent, but it's not really what they're in it for. They're brilliant, as we've discussed. They're opportunistic, very opportunistic. They'll see something and they'll turn it into gold in a very short period of time, which is why we often say, the many axioms that we have in chasing fraudsters, time is a fraudster's greatest asset. And because they're opportunistic, that's the reason. They're constantly looking for other ways to land on their feet. And if you get behind that curve in chasing them, then that's where you're going to stay. You're going to stay behind that curve. They're visible but not approachable. Of course, Madoff's the best example of that. They want to create an aura of being important. They have an alternate reality. There's always some other story, some other activity, some other wife, some other business. There's people in the organization that are there only needing to know what it is the fraudster needs them to know, and there might be another group of people that only know what they need to know relative to some other reality. And oftentimes, they will treat the various people within their domain as pawns, moving them as needed based on where it is that they're moving at that particular point in time. But their reality is not the same as ours, clearly not the same as ours. And so they operate very differently. And that understanding that helps us to be more predictive in what they've done, as well as, more importantly, what they're doing. They're pathological liars, unquestionably. I think that goes without saying. They're ego-driven control freaks. They control absolutely everything in their domain, as we discussed. They have double standards. They'll be with their wife one night and then be with their mistress the next and then go to church on the third. And they are creatures of patterns. I can say honestly in 23 years that all the professional fraudsters are basically operating out of the same playbook. So they require buy-in, enrollment, they have dependencies, they depend on investors, lawyers, accountants, other professionals, other participants. And these people, again, are given only the amount of information necessary for them to do the job that the fraudster needs them to do. If you've come into contact with a fraudster, you might recognize this axiom. A fraudster doesn't hire the best attorneys. A fraudster hires the attorneys that will do whatever it is that the fraudster needs them to do. So most of the attorneys, by far most of the attorneys, that are first representing fraudsters when I come upon them are not best in show. These are attorneys who will not take the time to conduct any type of due diligence relative to what they're being told. These are attorneys that I believe, as I've written in various articles, are exposing themselves with great risk to claims of violation of the rules of professional responsibility because they aren't asking necessary questions relative to the conduct of their client. Case in point, several law firms have been sued over the last several years relative to their representation of known Ponzi schemers and other nefarious individuals. And we're seeing, though there's procedural difficulties in getting to them, we're seeing now the shield being penetrated and attorneys and accountants being held accountable for not recognizing the red flags. So I'm in that 10% area of law right now. I want to touch on one very important legal concept, but it'll help sort of create this illustration for you what I'm talking about. We call it willful blindness. Willful blindness is a creature actually of the Supreme Court. It came out of the criminal context, and now it's being applied in the civil context to identify that zone between should have known and actual knowledge. Those of you that practice in the area know that conspiracy or aiding and abetting requires substantial assistance with actual knowledge. And actual knowledge is not should have known. Actual knowledge is you did know. But now courts are saying, lawyers and accountants beware, because you could be willfully blind and actual knowledge will be imposed upon you. So, if you miss the red flags in your representation of someone, you may be subject to a claim of willful blindness. And if your services help perpetrate the fraud, even unintentionally, you could be held civilly accountable in a claim for aiding and abetting or conspiracy to commit that fraud. I speak from personal experience on this. We've had success in this area several times. So they need the buy-in of people who are willing to overlook red flags, whether that's a clerical person, a lawyer, an accountant, the investors themselves. They need people who will overlook the red flags. That's their enrollment. And dominating wife. Now, I put in parentheses here, yes, almost all are men. The largest of the Ponzi schemes, the largest of the fraud schemes are almost 100% men, almost 100%. There are women fraudsters out there, but they tend to be in the occupational fraud area. They're working within an organization, some at the executive level, some lower, and they're taking smaller amounts of money. I don't know if that's just because they're being more polite, but they're taking smaller amounts of money, so they're not in the mainstream media so much. And I'm not certain that we'd call Martha Stewart a fraudster necessarily with all of her problems. She was more wrapped up into an insider trading problem, and more specifically, she just wasn't helping the investigation along. Now I think she's back in court recently on yet another matter. But most of these are men, and almost all the time we have discovered that there is a very interesting dynamic here. Think about, again, my relationship back to primordial beings, Neanderthal and our early human ancestors. Who ruled the domain? When hubby was out waving his club, bringing home the bacon, who ruled the domain when he returned? The women did. This is a cultural piece that we can actually draw a parallel to currently. The woman ruled the domain. And I have seen this over and over again. Oftentimes we bring the wives in because maybe they were the recipients of fraudulent transfers, or they've got the keys to a checkbook, or for whatever reason, we find lots of very valuable information from the willfully blind spouse of the fraudster. And when we bring them in, They usually come in with their willful blindness and all, and they're very docile and they're very polite, and they don't really mind so much that they've been inconvenienced, and they're delightful to meet and all that. But when I start pushing and we get them off their pedestal a bit, they get downright mean. And I've seen this time and time again. They get hostile. And sometimes that's worked to our advantage because they go back to the husband and say, get rid of this. You're causing great bother for me, the children. Get rid of this. So we've sometimes used that to our advantage. But other times we've seen some very interesting fallout. Fraudsters beware. If you're going to fraudulently transfer your assets to the spouse, be sure the spouse isn't going to leave you. And so we've certainly seen that happen when the spouse thinks, well, this is getting too hot for me. I best get out of here. And so they bolt with the goods. Pretty funny byproduct of some of these chases. All right, so with that, let's take another look at probably a more novel, more recent theory as to why the fraudster is the fraudster. And that's from Linda Mealy, who wrote in the Sociobiology of Sociopathy that fraudsters are unable to acquire mates through female choice. So this guy just needs to strut his peacock feathers more. I'm not so certain, as funny as that might be, that that's too dissimilar with the theory that fraudsters need to show superiority. And maybe through superiority, what they're doing is they're attracting the opposite sex. Could be, don't know, recent theory, interesting, ponder that one for a while. So while we ask the question, are we talking psychopathic or sociopathic, let's jump to some of the favorite things that fraudsters tell me when we first come upon them, knowing that they are who they are. And these are all very predictable responses. I'm certain many of you who have any time in this area can see for themselves or have heard for themselves some of these responses. So we're going to come after you for the money, and this is assuming they're not already in jail and somebody hasn't already collected all of the assets through a bankruptcy proceeding or receivership. They'll say, well, the economy. The real estate developers love this one, right? So, you owe $28 million on that commercial project, and the real estate developer says, sorry, despite my $78 million balance sheet that I handed you in 2005, the economy has resulted in me having zero value. I'm now negative $13.5 million. So a great response. Also, another of my favorite, actually, by the way, of real estate developers is if the fraud hasn't been caught yet and there's in a defaulted loan and the workout group gets it, a special asset group gets it, and they make that first phone call and they say, we've got to work this thing out. One of my favorites is they say, if you would loan me an additional $5 million, I'll be able to finish the project and we're all going to make a lot of money. Any bankers out there, I got to bet that you've heard that one before, or some variant of it along the lines of, it's your fault that you loaned me the money, or, you didn't loan me enough money. Lots of excuses from the fraudsters, but again, think about it. That's all a shift in accountability. Shifting accountability, a key response by a fraudster. I'm going to file BK. They're getting less traction out of this one than they used to because there are people like myself and many other fine trustees out there who aren't putting up with bankruptcy fraud. And so I often say when they say that they're going to file BK, you get in. I'll drive. Because bankruptcy courts can be a fabulous place to play. A lot of creditors believe that once they go into BK, there's nothing left to do. That's just not often the case. I had to get all to my wife. Fake divorces, love these, seen lots of them. They will go so far as to say, honey, we're gonna have this divorce. I'm going to give you that. It's the only way you're going to be able to continue to get the allowance that I give you. So bear with me, sign this document, and everything's going to be okay. And they have a divorce and a marital settlement agreement, and all the property gets shifted to the wife. Love those. Okay, so that's what I say in response to the fraudster. Is that your final answer? Because it's unacceptable to me. So psychological profiling is where we're at. Doesn't matter what you're doing, doesn't matter what area you're in, doesn't matter how the fraudster's coming to you. The very first thing we got to do is profile that fraudster. Because now more than ever, it's essential to understand the psychological makeup and the personality traits and faults of a fraudster in order to effectively dissect their scheme and recover the hidden assets. Think about this for a while. You have to decode the fraudster's theme, not just his actions. We could spend a lot of time picking apart the bank statements and understanding how the money went in, where it went, so on and so forth. That's all an after-the-fact analysis. That's terrific if all you want to do is put together the criminal case to say this guy was wrong, he undertook this Ponzi scheme, and let's put him away for 50 years. So that's important stuff, but it's not the end of the analysis. If you want to deal with how to prevent fraud in the first place, if you want to deal with go or no-go decisions of going into transactions, go no-go decisions of going into loans, if you want a go no-go decision with respect to joint ventures, if you want to discover where did the money go and claw it back, all of these things require more than just a technical analysis of the bank statements, or as I like to say, the $60 online Google search. Asset searches for $60 on Google are worth exactly that, $60. So kiss that 60 goodbye. That's not understanding how to recover money from a fraudster. That's just understanding what stuff the fraudster happened to put in his own name. And if he's a fraudster worth his weight in gold, he's not going to be putting a lot of stuff in his own name. So you go on some wild goose chases with $60 online asset searches. So no matter what you're doing, no matter what area you're in, if you've never ever dealt with a fraudster before but just simply want to make sure you don't deal with one, the questions that have to be asked are very different now than those that were asked in the past. We're getting more calls today than ever before by private equity, venture capital, hedge fund clients who now realize that while in the past they've done a very good job up until about 2007 or 2008 understanding the investment and the credit risks, now we're in a very different playing field. Fraud takes on a different look as the economy takes on a different look, as banking takes on a different look, as security investing takes on a different look. I'm going to sit on a round table in a couple of weeks and we're going to discuss the idea of can you regulate against fraud? And my answer is flat out no. You can't. How does the saying go? Get a bigger mouse trap, that cliche. Well, that's effectively what's happening. Fraudsters are intelligent. They're going to work around whatever regulation you put in place. Regulations require paperwork and filing and disclosures and things like that. Fraudsters know that stuff. Fraudsters know courts, too. You can't create a court system that's going to stop the fraudster. As we always say, court is a line item on the business plan of a fraudster. Fraudsters use court as a tool. They understand delay. They understand that judges don't always throw the anvil on the first day at court. So they use these things to their advantage. Very intelligent. All right, let's jump to some examples. I'm going to give you a small one here. This was only a $1 million claim, but it was fun. I had a lot of fun with this one. We're looking here at, we'll call him Mr. M. And this is Mr. M's passport that we were able to get. And actually seize, so he wouldn't travel during the period of time that we were conducting investigation. How did this come to me? Mr. M was the target of an arbitration award. Our client had an arbitration against this guy who was a developer and actually won an award for about $1 million. So it was $871, had interest and costs and all things like that. This guy loved to play in Las Vegas, which is always a fun place to do investigations. And I was told that he was a scummy guy by arbitration counsel. So that was the early stage of my involvement in the case. Scummy guy, real estate developer, owes $1 million. Do something about it. So all right, we got down to business. In trying to understand who this guy was, yeah, we did asset searches, right? We looked at databases, Secretary of State, FAA, Coast Guard, Recorder's Office, DMV, a lot of the typical stuff. We go to the internet, we look at articles, so on and so forth. But most importantly, we had to understand what this guy was about. What does he covet? What's the most important thing to this guy? Right? So what is it that, sorry if I double click there. My apologies. I'll get to the right screen here for you. There we go. Great, there we go. So getting down to business. what was his story? That's what I want to know. I want to know, what is he doing now? I don't want to know what he was doing 5 days ago or 10 days ago or 2 years ago. A lot of attorneys out there, very fine, competent litigation attorneys, and they profess to handle fraud cases. But, if you're going to spend all of your time in a fraud case looking at the past, then you're going to lose, because by the time you get your judgment, where are you then? You're 2 more years behind the fraudster. And as I said earlier, get behind that curve, stay behind that curve. What was important to us is uncovering the theme. What is the theme? What does this guy do now? What's important to him? We have to decipher the story. So my write-ups to the client are not, he's got a house in Vegas, he's got a yacht in Miami, he's got a place in Paris. Mine are, let me tell you the story of Mr. M. And in understanding that story, you are then leveraging the success you will have in uncovering the fraud itself, if you haven't fully uncovered it yet, and clawing back the assets. So what did we learn? Well, we learned that Mr. M had a fabulous house, and I'll tell you about one more trophy moment of mine here. He had a big old house down in Austin, and that came relatively easily to us, that we had this house. But what I found is that the house had just recently been listed, kind of a pre-listing. And before I was actually in the case, I typed a note out to the broker down in Austin. I said, boy, that house looks magnificent. It was listed for something like $4.5 million. I said, that house is magnificent. Would love to see it. And she said, great. When's the next time you're going to be in Austin? And I said, well, how about next week? Terrific. Tuesday at 1:30. Done. Tuesday at 1:30, I show up at the house. There was the broker, and she walked me through the house. And my favorite line was when she said, maybe you want to go through it one more time on your own. I said, terrific. Would love to. Took out my little notebook, wrote down some license plates, a couple of things I noticed here or there. What kind of computers does the guy have? Looked at some of the fine things that were in his walk-in closets, and all perfectly legal because they invited me in, and I didn't lie. And they went to the court, and they said, oh my gosh, Mr. Levin this, and Mr. Levin that, Mr. Levin this, and the judge laughed. Sounds like good field work on Mr. Levin's part. But it was important not just to see the house. It was important to see the way the guy's living and learn more of the story. So yeah, the house was great, but actually seeing the story within it, that's what was important. We found boats, and we found cars, we found planes, and his wives and kids. He had a former wife and the new wife, and we found all these people. And here was the most important piece, though, the Dubai connection. This guy, being the real estate developer that he was, and having experienced a lot of the same downfalls during the real estate, bubble burst in 2007, 2008, had a lot of distressed projects, very distressed. We're talking major shopping centers and the like, millions and millions of dollars sitting out there in liabilities now as a result of these projects. So being the opportunistic guy that he was and understanding a lot about what's going on over in Dubai, he decided to start a fund. And that fund was going to do what? It was going to invest in distressed real estate. Which distressed real estate? Well, his distressed real estate. So he actually put a fund together to get investors from Dubai to invest in distressed real estate in the U.S. as a land play. Well, when we found that part out, we really had him. I went to Dubai, and I purposely went in front of his office, and I called up his counsel, and oftentimes when his counsel would get on the phone, he'd put Mr. M on the phone too. We had gotten to that point in our relationship, and I said, Mr. M, this office in Dubai of yours is magnificent. Wow, this is really cool. You're in a great location. And he freaked. Not on the phone. He was very calm on the phone. We got paid a week later because I was going to penetrate the now. The now being his next scheme. So while we're recovering from something that had happened 2, 3, 4 years ago, we were focusing on what was happening now and understanding that that would be more important to this guy than just about anything else in his existence today. And once you get there, you've penetrated the shield. And no, this is not Mr. M, but that is his wife, who's from the Ukraine. Okay, so that's example number one. The result then was that we got paid very rapidly, and although there was a bit of a payout component to it. We protected ourselves through that payout component period with a very draconian settlement agreement that had receiverships in place with 24/7 monitoring, temporary injunctions. He was on an allowance on what he could and couldn't spend. We had charging orders against many of his 30 or 40 different entities, turnover orders on those entities. We insisted that he have a life insurance policy with the client as a beneficiary. He was still obligated to give us every document that we would ask for going forward, should we ask for it, including the scanning of all of his computers, and obviously a full release. We had a claim on a piece of his real estate as well. So within 90 days of being assigned the job, we uncovered the story and got to the point of bringing this guy to the table with $900,000 as opposed to $870,000 or whatever the original amount was. So what's the anatomy of a successful fraud case? And every time I see that photo, I still love it. Hope you're enjoying it as well. A fraudster's greatest asset is time, as I've said. You've got to work fast. If you know about the fraud or you smell something bad, as many of my clients say when the case stinks, call Neal, you've got to work fast because fraudsters with time can do amazing things. You have to have an intensive collection of intelligence. You can't sit on a personal financial statement from a fraudster. That's completely useless. You can't sit on a $40 Google asset search. You've got to get out there and you've got to collect intelligence in a very comprehensive and intensive time frame in order to get neck and neck with the fraudster. You got to develop the story. You got to penetrate the shield. And then a crippling response. Once the noose goes on, don't take the noose off. So this is true in just about any context. Whether you are conducting due diligence for FCPA compliance or post-FCPA monitoring obligations, asset recovery, judgment enforcement, or due diligence pre-transaction, whether it's an investment, you're working with a new fund manager, you're doing a joint venture, you're making a private equity play, a venture capital play. It's essential that we play now in a different intelligence plane. We have to ask different questions. We got to seek out different answers. We have to have a better understanding of the players so that we can more quickly identify fraudsters ahead of time, or if we are coming in after the fact, more quickly recover from the fraudster afterwards. So we're in a very different landscape now thanks to what occurred in 2006, 2007, 2009, 10, and the game has changed. Investing has forever changed. Asset recovery work has changed. Litigation has changed. And to leverage success in all these areas, intelligence, actionable intelligence is the key. We have to do a better job of understanding the mindset of the people who we're working with, spot red flags of fraudsters, or rule out, hopefully, that you're dealing with a fraudster so that you can go in with a lower risk go decision on your transactions or into litigation. I think I have a little bit of time here, if I'm not mistaken, Brad, for a couple more case studies.
Yep, absolutely.
Great. So we'll run down just a short list of some of my favorite. Had a return trip to Dubai. Who would have thought that I have two cases in Dubai within the same year and a half? But had a reason to go back. This was a fascinating case. California-based client, large corporation, had done business with, surprisingly enough, go figure, an assetless shell in the British Virgin Islands. That was the contracting party. We can spend a lot of time talking about why that may have been so, this large corporation with a large bank of attorneys at their disposal, but they did. Let me just touch on one part of that. I said I would come back to it a little earlier. Greed is the wound upon which the fraudster preys. If we don't have greed, we don't have fraud. It's as simple as that. It's a harsh reality. If we don't have greed, we don't have fraud. Why did Ma and Pa Kettle invest all of their savings in Madoff? That violates Investing 101. to put all your eggs in one basket, zero diversification. I feel bad for them. I do. I really do. But at the same time, it's not the way to invest. And the reason they invested that way is because of greed, because of the large returns being promised. I once said to a bank who had done business with a guy that actually had already gotten in trouble before, I said, "What were you thinking? Why did you go back into bed with this guy?" Well, he said, we wanted to make money, and we felt like this time around we were smarter than him. Again, back to the superiority game. But for what purpose? To make money. It's greed. So oftentimes we need to also then look at the investor, the lender, the joint venture, anyone who's actually making the investment to try and make money, who is willing to turn their cheek on red flags. Now, some of them are really good, right? Some of them have done a fabulous job of covering up. Madoff got away with it a long time, even though there certainly was a guy out there who had picked him for what he was early on, and the SEC is the one who turned the cheek. But for the most part, these guys have been relying on the fact that they will convince people to buy a lot on the moon. If we don't have people who for some reason think that they want to have a lot on the moon that they could have their grandkids go and visit, then our buddy Dennis Hope, who's selling those lots, doesn't have a business. Why do we keep getting those emails in our inboxes talking about some princess from some African nation who needs help and wants to transfer $10 million into our bank account? Because there are ultimately people out there who are giving them the bank account information. If they weren't, then we wouldn't be getting those inbox messages anymore. So that's a sort of a elongated answer. I want to give you a short answer as to why it was that my client was dealing with a shell corporation in the British Virgin Islands, but they were. So the key for us was to uncover the story. Who were these people? Well, the client knew that these people actually were somewhere out in the Middle East, and they were doing some type of telecommunications business out there because that was the nature of the transaction. And so we immediately started our intelligence gathering out in the Middle East. And within about 3 or 4 weeks' time, we realized that there was an extremely convoluted set of transactions and mergers and joint ventures, which involved funds out of both Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. And they were ultimately the parents up 3 or 4 levels of this entity in the British Virgin Islands. And so I would go back to Dubai with a document that we had prepared about 6 or 7 inches thick and knock on the door of the CEO, knowing they probably wouldn't see me directly. And so I got his assistant. I said, "I think your boss needs to see this document. I'm going to sit in the tea house across the street over there, and after he's done reading it, give me a call." And the document was actually a court filing that we were going to file, which would attempt to seize all inbound assets of the parent corporations to the United States, where we would attach those assets to try and satisfy the judgment under various veil-piercing theories. And one of the key elements to that was that we were going to notify all the people that they were doing business with in the United States so that they would understand why they shouldn't expect payment. Well, we got paid 3 days after I got back. And it wasn't because we filed the case. Court's great. Court's a terrific tool. You get lots of great leverage in court. But I'll tell you, court's just a tool. It's not the end game. And so with that, we were able to get these people to the table and satisfy their obligation because we had found sort of the backstory, and they didn't want us going much further. So with that, why don't we turn to some questions? I think there might be some out there. Brad?
Great, yeah. We've received a number of questions, and a few of them sort of challenging the notion that it's not about the money. Someone asks, how do you interpret the famous comment about fools and their money are soon parted? And sort of a related question, if it's not about the money, why do people buy 10 cars and 10 houses?
Okay, so great questions. And as I said, I get challenged on this all the time. It's a great debate. Next, maybe tonight's dinner, bring it up and have it with your friends and family. It's a terrific question, but you've got to think about it. The fraud, the money really is a byproduct. A lot of the fraudsters don't have a lot of the money. If you think about how much money went through the hands of a Ponzi schemer, for instance, think Bernie Madoff, to use a great illustration. He didn't have $60 billion. That money was required to perpetuate the scheme. Ponzi schemers especially have to reinvest the money. They're constantly paying it back out. Now, Bernie liked his toys. Bernie certainly had some decent toys. He had the place in Paris and the yacht, and he had the Manhattan condo. He definitely had his toys. But really, when it comes right down to it, that was just a pittance. That was a small, small amount compared to what actually passed through his hands. And so I think that's really good proof right there that having had access to that much money, he could have moved to Taiwan years ago with huge bundles of money instead of putting it back out onto the streets. Why didn't he just keep it? Why did he keep it going? Who wouldn't stop once they had $1 billion in their hands? A fraudster won't. A fraudster won't because they got to keep it going. And that's just such a backward response to us that once you had that much, more than you could ever possibly need, that you would keep going. He didn't stop because he had enough. He stopped because he was worried that people were getting too close, and he wanted to try and save his family, and so he admitted what he did. So lots more dialogue that we can have on that question, but it's not about the money for that reason. If it were about the money, we'd see them grab the money and go, but they don't. They keep going because once they realize they're smarter and they're getting away with it, they want to keep that image going for themselves.
Great. The next question is a little more technical. Someone writes in, when performing potential fraud investigations, I use the Been Verified database to show the individuals that are associated with each other somehow in public records. But he says the database does not show the actual link between the individuals, and he's wondering, is there another resource or different tool that can uncover the actual connection? Do you know of anything?
Sure, hire us. We'd be glad to share it for you. No, seriously though, there are tools out there. There are some good ones and bad ones. Okay, the most popular, LexisNexis, Westlaw, People Finder, things like that, tend to have very old data. I don't like those products. I like those companies. They provide great tools elsewhere, but I don't like those particular products as far as asset searches are concerned because they're not calling current data. As far as relationships, they, of course, didn't touch any of that, but they would, for instance, put up names that pop in public records similar to the public records that we're pulling. So, for instance, co-directors or co-officers or even neighbors. I haven't found anything that does a really good job of giving you with great assurance and high credibility true relationships that aren't painfully obvious from the public records. So we often are left to create those stories ourselves. But there are some good databases out there that are better than those two. You can search around, but if you do this work, definitely get away from those two old products and look at some of those that are getting more current data. But nothing beats going to all the sources directly yourself, of course.
So here's an interesting question, more related to the psychology of the fraudsters. Does every fraudster in his own mind think that someday he'll hit it big and pay everything back, or does this tend not to be a concern?
No, they think they're going to hit it big and not worry about paying it back because, if they don't have to pay it back, why do it? They're only going to do what they have to do when they have to do it. I was just quoted in a Chicago Cranes article about real estate developers and whether or not the ones that sort of went down hard and may have been accused of this, that, and the next thing are going to come back, or are they moving on to become insurance salesmen or car dealers? I say once a real estate developer, always a real estate developer. These guys who have gone down hard and even some that have been accused of wrongdoing are still in the game. It's a great way for them to do what they do because it doesn't require a lot of people. It doesn't require a big organization. They can create their little network of pawns and worker bees that only need to know what they need to know. It's a terrific world for them, and they find real estate exciting because it's big, it's tangible, and they can stamp their name on it and make themselves look bigger than they are. So I'm not saying that these guys go down and stop. I first came into the business thinking that I would change these people, right? I was going to change the fraudster, going to get them to stop committing fraud. And boy, what a rude awakening I got. It's very, very difficult to change human nature. It's difficult indeed to change the wiring of a fraudster, just as it's going to be difficult to change the mindset of those that have tended to invest in the fraudster, which is why I don't believe we can truly regulate around fraud.
Great. Well, Neal and everybody, we're out of time, but I appreciate your time and the time of all our attendees. I think it was a very interesting and different session, and I hope everybody found as much value as I did.
Brad, thanks very much, and thanks to everyone for attending.